The warm December sun gently bathed the terrace of our home in Seville. I sat on a lounge chair, idly flipping through a magazine filled with tips on decorating for the holidays. The air carried the light scent of orange trees, blending with the aroma of coffee that Raul brewed every morning. These moments of comfort were our unchanging rituals. Raul sat nearby, hunched over his laptop. He typed rapidly, occasionally pausing to adjust his glasses. I enjoyed watching him during these moments, calm, composed, the embodiment of reliability. And yet, despite this stability, I occasionally caught myself thinking our life had become too predictable. The sound of his laptop closing caught my attention. Raul looked up and smiled, squinting slightly in the sunlight. "I have an idea I think you'll love." I set the magazine aside and turned slightly, raising an eyebrow in anticipation. "My brother Alejandro has invited us to spend the holidays at his place in the mountains," he said as if it were the most ordinary news. I looked at him in surprise. Alejandro's name rarely came up in our family, though I knew they stayed in touch. My husband's older brother had always seemed elusive to me, successful, constantly traveling, living a completely different life. "The mountains?" I repeated, unable to hide a hint of uncertainty. "Yes, real winter, snow, fireplaces. You've never seen anything like it. It'll be a wonderful change of scenery." His voice brimmed with enthusiasm. I didn't answer immediately. The mountains and snow seemed distant, cold, nothing like our cozy home. Yet something about Raul's proposal intrigued me. Maybe it was the desire to experience something new, to step outside the familiar. "All right," I said finally, with a faint smile that seemed to please him. We left the next day. The journey took several hours. Gradually, the green hills gave way to snow-covered peaks, and the air grew colder. Raul occasionally stopped to take photos on his phone. I watched the scenery, feeling how the silent majesty of it all stirred my curiosity. By the time we reached Alejandro's house, it was already dark. The large wooden cottage, bathed in soft light, looked like something out of a fairy tale. At the entrance, we were greeted by a tall man with a broad smile. His posture, the confidence in his movements, and the intensity of his gaze immediately set him apart. "Welcome," he said, embracing Raul before turning his attention to me. "Isabel, I'm glad to finally meet you." "Likewise," I replied, sensing how his deep voice seemed to vibrate in the air. When he took my hand to shake it, I noticed his warm palm lingered just a moment longer than necessary. I quickly averted my gaze, trying to suppress the strange flutter of unease that had no explanation. The house was just as cozy inside as it was outside. Wooden walls, the soft glow of lamps, a crackling fireplace. Alejandro showed us to our rooms and then suggested we gather for dinner. I noticed how his gaze discreetly followed me, lingering now and then, but I tried not to give it any importance. Later, lying in bed next to Raul, I tried to fall asleep, but thoughts of meeting Alejandro kept resurfacing in my mind. There was something unusual about him, something captivating, confidence in every move, sincerity in his words. And that gaze, it was as if he saw right through me. In the darkness, I closed my eyes and decided to attribute my thoughts to the impressions of the journey and the new place. But even so, they wouldn't leave me until morning. Alejandro's home looked like something out of a postcard. A cozy wooden cottage with large panoramic windows that framed a breathtaking view of the snow-capped mountains. The soft glow of the lamps reflected off polished wooden walls, and the scent of pine and the fireplace filled the air with warmth. Alejandro guided us confidently through the house, showing us the rooms and shared spaces. His movements were calm but carried a certain energy, an assurance unique to those completely at ease in their surroundings. This house was his domain, his reflection. I found myself unsettled by his confidence in a way I couldn't quite explain. We stopped on the second floor where our rooms were. Raul joked lightly about how the house seemed bigger than he remembered from their childhood. Alejandro simply smiled as he showed us the bedroom where we'd be staying. "You'll be comfortable here," he said, opening the door. "The view from this window is the best in the house." I peeked inside. A spacious room with a wide bed and a large window that framed the sight of snow delicately settling on pine branches. Raul thanked his brother, while I simply nodded, avoiding Alejandro's gaze for too long. There was a subtle tension in his presence that I couldn't ignore. When it was time for dinner, we gathered around a large wooden table in the main room. The meal was simple yet hearty: hot soup, crusty bread, and red wine. Alejandro proved to be an excellent storyteller. He spoke of his travels, sharing amusing anecdotes that made Raul laugh, while I listened with growing curiosity. "Next year, I'm thinking of heading to Patagonia," he said, finishing his glass. "The mountains there are entirely different. Every place has its own character." "You travel too much, brother," Raul replied, leaning back in his chair. "Maybe it's time to settle down and think about a family." Alejandro smiled, but his eyes flickered with an unreadable emotion. "Everyone chooses their own path, Raul." I felt his gaze linger on me again, but I tried not to let it show that it unsettled me. My husband was thoroughly engrossed in the conversation, discussing some project they both seemed to be working on. Alejandro responded calmly, but there was a subtle condescension in his tone, as if he could shift the discussion in any direction he wanted at a moment's notice. The contrast between the brothers was striking. Raul, good-natured and dependable with his steady confidence. Alejandro, dynamic, almost predatory. His mannerisms, his voice, his gaze, all of it stirred something within me that I couldn't quite grasp. As the dinner wound down, Alejandro raised his glass and said, "To snow, to adventure, and to an unforgettable winter." His voice was firm, almost ceremonious. I lifted my glass, but in that moment our eyes met. His gaze held mine over the rim, and I felt my cheeks flush. Later, lying in bed, I tried to banish the memory of that moment. I wanted to convince myself it was just my imagination. But the warmth of his gaze and that instant when I forgot Raul was sitting beside me replayed in my mind over and over again. Morning in the mountains began with soft light streaming through the curtains. I rose from bed earlier than Raul and walked to the window. Snow sparkled in the sunlight, and light smoke curled from the chimney. In the distance, I caught sight of a dark figure. It was Alejandro strolling near the house. At breakfast, Alejandro suggested a walk to a nearby waterfall. "It's stunning, especially in the morning," he said. Raul, sipping his coffee, declined. "I have work to finish. You two go ahead," he added with his usual calm. I hesitated, but something in Alejandro's tone made it hard to refuse. "All right," I replied, wrapping my scarf tightly and buttoning my jacket. The cold outside was sharp but invigorating. Alejandro led the way, confidently navigating the snowy trail. We talked about nature and travel, but the conversation shifted when he suddenly asked, "Are you happy, Isabel?" I froze for a moment, startled by the directness of his question. "Of course," I replied, trying to sound composed, but his eyes lingered on me, as if he didn't believe my answer. "You look like someone who loses herself sometimes," he said softly. His words struck a nerve. I averted my gaze, focusing on the snow-covered trees to avoid meeting his eyes. But inside something stirred uneasily. When we reached the waterfall, I momentarily forgot everything. The icy rocks glistened in the sunlight, and frozen streams of water formed intricate patterns. Alejandro remained silent, watching me as I took it all in. His presence felt almost overwhelming, and I avoided looking at him for too long. On the way back, the trail became slipperier. I focused on each step, but at one point I lost my footing. In an instant, strong hands caught me around the waist, preventing me from falling. I looked up to thank him, but froze when our eyes met. We stood so close I could see every detail of his face. His gaze dropped to my lips, and I felt my breath hitch. For a brief moment, time seemed to stop. Our faces were so close I could feel his warm breath on my skin. His hands didn't release me, holding me steady as if afraid I might fall again. My eyes, almost involuntarily, flicked to his lips, and a strange, inexplicable desire swept over me. But the moment lasted only a second. Alejandro stepped back, carefully helping me stand upright. "Be careful," he said quietly, his hands lingering until I regained my balance. "Thank you," I whispered, feeling my cheeks flush. The rest of the walk was silent. I quickened my pace, hoping to hide the turmoil inside me. When we returned to the house, I immediately retreated to my room, trying to calm down. but the image of his face and that fleeting moment when our lips were just a breath apart stayed with me. The house was quiet. Raul, exhausted from the day, had fallen asleep early. His steady breathing filled the bedroom, but I couldn't sleep. Thoughts of the day, of the walk with Alejandro, wouldn't leave me. I tried focusing on the books I'd brought with me, but the words blurred on the page. I threw on a light cardigan and stepped out of the room. The house was silent, the only sound coming from the crackling fire in the living room's fireplace. The shared space, bathed in warm light, looked almost magical. I walked closer to the fire to warm myself and leaned on the back of a chair. "Can't sleep?" a voice said, startling me. Alejandro was sitting in the corner of the room, a glass of wine in hand. His voice was low, almost a whisper, careful not to wake anyone. He smiled faintly, and once again that strange flutter of unease took hold of me. "A little," I replied, trying to sound composed. He stood and gestured for me to sit. On the coffee table was a bottle of wine and a second glass. "Would you like some?" he asked, motioning toward the glass. I nodded, feeling how this simple gesture seemed to draw us closer. Alejandro poured the wine and handed me the glass. "For company," he said with a soft smile. We started with small talk, how beautiful the stars were in the mountains, the plans for tomorrow, but gradually his questions became more personal, as if he were trying to see into my thoughts. "You know," he began, leaning back in his chair, "sometimes I envy Raul." I frowned slightly, unsure what he meant. "Envy? He has something I could never hold on to," he said, looking directly at me. His voice carried sincerity, but also something else, hidden pain or longing. I averted my gaze, trying not to dwell on what he might mean. "You always seem to get what you want," I said softly, hoping to lighten the mood. Alejandro leaned forward, his gaze growing more intense. "Not always. There are some things you can't have, no matter how much you try." His words were barely above a whisper, but they struck a chord. A heavy silence hung between us, thick with tension. I suddenly realized how close we were sitting. He reached out slowly, his fingers brushing against mine. His touch was gentle, sending a shiver up my arm. Before I could pull away or speak, he moved closer, and suddenly his lips were near mine. I didn't move, but I didn't pull back either. It all happened too quickly, and yet it felt agonizingly slow. His lips met mine, soft but decisive. It was wrong. I knew it was. But in that moment, logic disappeared, leaving only the overwhelming sensation of his closeness. The kiss was brief but intense. I suddenly pulled away as if snapping out of a dream. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might echo in the room. I began, but the words wouldn't come. I stood abruptly and left without another word, returning to the bedroom. Raul was still asleep. I sat on the edge of the bed, trying to steady my breathing. Inside me was a storm of guilt, fear, and a strange, unfamiliar longing. This night would never just be another night. On the slopes, I tried to stay close to Raul, but his enthusiasm for speed and technique quickly left me far behind. I couldn't keep up with him, nor did I have the energy to try. Alejandro, on the other hand, stayed nearby, unobtrusively helping me navigate tricky patches and picking up the poles I had dropped. "Are you okay?" he asked after one such moment, looking directly into my eyes. I nodded briefly, feeling both annoyed and flustered by his attentiveness. At one point, we stopped at the edge of the slope. The view of the mountains was breathtaking. Snow-covered peaks stretched endlessly into the horizon, with sunlight breaking through the clouds. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Alejandro asked, but his tone suggested he was speaking of something more. I remained silent, taking in the moment, until he leaned closer and quietly said, "You look like someone trying to run away from something." I turned sharply to face him. "That's none of your business," I replied, striving to keep my voice steady. Alejandro only smiled, and there was something provocative in that smile. "Maybe not, but it seems like you haven't decided where to run yet." His words struck a nerve. They sounded truthful, as if he could see right through me. I averted my eyes and stepped back, feeling the snowy silence around us grow unbearably loud. Raul soon caught up with us, his voice breaking the tension in the air. He was in his element, energetic and happy, something I couldn't help but notice. But something inside me had already shifted, and I knew I could no longer ignore it. Evening fell quietly, as it often does in the mountains. Snow continued to drift gently outside the windows, enveloping the house in a serene atmosphere. Raul was in the living room flipping through work documents while I stood in front of the mirror in our bedroom deciding what to wear. Tonight, I wanted to focus on him, on us. I chose his favorite dress, a black one with slightly bare shoulders that always caught his attention. Letting my hair down, I added a touch of blush and adjusted my earrings. Looking at my reflection, I tried to convince myself that I could forget the day, forget Alejandro. When I went downstairs, Raul looked up from his papers and smiled. "You look stunning," he said, setting the documents aside. We settled at the table where glasses of wine were already waiting. I tried to be attentive, asking him about his work, recalling old jokes that never failed to make him laugh. He seemed pleased. His eyes glowed with warmth, and I could feel his gratitude for my attention growing with each moment. "Thank you for tonight," he said when we finished dinner. "It reminds me of our early dates." His words stirred something inside me. They should have warmed me, but instead I felt a faint pang of guilt. Was it normal to have to make an effort to feel close again? We went upstairs to our bedroom where Raul suggested we linger a little longer. I didn't object. His touch was gentle, familiar, bringing a sense of safety. The spark of passion made me forget everything for a moment. I focused on him, his smile, his warmth. But even in those moments, my thoughts wandered elsewhere. Alejandro's face surfaced in my mind. His gaze, that moment on the slope when his words made me question myself. I fought to push those images away, to concentrate on the present, on Raul. But it felt like battling a tidal wave. Afterward, we lay side by side with Raul holding my hand tightly. He looked content, relaxed, as if the world was perfectly in order. I, however, stared at the ceiling, feeling the conflict within me intensify. I loved my husband. His care, his warmth had always been my anchor. But why then did I feel this persistent unease, as if part of me already belonged to someone else? The weight of guilt settled heavily on my chest. I tried convincing myself that this was just a fleeting weakness, that I could become the wife Raul deserved again. But deep down, I already knew that this internal struggle wouldn't fade so easily. The morning was clear and cold. Sunlight pierced through the tall pines, reflecting off the snow. Over breakfast, Alejandro suggested a hike to a viewpoint with the best view of the mountains. "It's a short hike," he said. "A couple of hours there and back." Raul, holding a spoonful of muesli, shook his head. "I'm busy today with work. You can go with Alejandro if you'd like," he said to me without a hint of suspicion. I nodded, trying to mask the turmoil inside me. The trail wound upward, weaving through a snow-covered forest. For the first few minutes, we walked in silence, letting the sounds of nature surround us. But with each step, the tension grew more palpable. We had left the house and all its concerns far behind. It was just us, the snow, and the sound of our footsteps. Alejandro walked ahead, occasionally glancing back at me. I felt nervous, but the strange thrill of being alive pushed me onward. "You made up your mind after all," he said, turning around. "About what?" "Coming here, with me." His voice was calm, but there was something more in his words. I said nothing, averting my gaze. We reached the summit suddenly. The snow opened up to reveal a spacious plateau. Before us stretched snow-covered peaks, reaching into the horizon. Around us, there wasn't a soul. The silence was all-encompassing, allowing us to take in the moment. "Beautiful, isn't it?" His voice broke the quiet. I nodded silently. But his gaze wasn't on the mountains. He was looking directly at me, intently, as if trying to read my thoughts. "You have no idea how much I wanted to be here with you, away from everyone," he said, stepping closer. I felt my breath catch and didn't know what to say. His hand rose to touch my face. His fingers were warm despite the cold. I didn't pull away. His closeness consumed me, leaving no room for rational thought. When his lips met mine, everything else ceased to exist. This wasn't just a kiss. It was a surge of passion, rising like an avalanche, consuming everything in its path. His hands slid to my waist, pulling me closer. The cold air stung my skin, but I no longer felt it. His fingers traced the bare skin of my neck and shoulders. My breathing grew ragged, and I felt a heat spread through my body despite the freezing air around us. We forgot about the world, about morals, about the possibility of being caught. The moment felt endless, a breaking point for all the restraint we had held onto. His movements were confident, filled with a desire neither of us could suppress any longer. I felt the cold snow beneath me as he lowered me to the frozen ground, but the chill disappeared the moment his hands touched my body. We were no longer careful. Everything in that moment fused together, the rawness of nature, the icy air, and our undeniable passion. We lost track of time. Only when our breathing began to steady did I suddenly realize where we were. Alejandro leaned over me, his face illuminated by the soft sunlight. There was satisfaction in his eyes, but also something deeper, an understanding that this boundary had been crossed forever. "We should go," I whispered, feeling the snow beneath me turn cold again. He nodded, helping me to my feet. We returned to the trail in silence, but I knew those moments would stay with me forever. We walked back home in complete silence. The snow crunched underfoot. The air was cool and crisp, but I couldn't feel it. It seemed as though everything inside me had turned to stone. Alejandro walked slightly ahead, glancing back occasionally to make sure I was still following. His face remained unreadable, but I felt as if every look he gave me burned right through me. The house greeted us with its familiar warmth. The fireplace crackled in the living room, and the smell of fresh coffee lingered in the air. Raul was there, entirely absorbed in his laptop and phone calls. "You're just in time," he said without looking up from the screen. "I'm almost finished." Alejandro gave a brief nod, silently removed his coat, and disappeared into his room. I followed suit, hoping the solitude would help me gather my thoughts. But even in my room, I couldn't find peace. The events on the mountain played over and over in my mind. Every touch, every word, every second of that reckless closeness. I clenched my hands into fists to suppress the tremors that overtook me. I avoided looking in the mirror, afraid of seeing not just my reflection, but a woman I no longer recognized. When I went down for dinner, Alejandro was already there. He sat in the corner, calmly sipping wine and listening to Raul enthusiastically discuss plans for the next day. I took my seat across from my husband, making a conscious effort not to meet Alejandro's gaze. "Tomorrow we need to head into the nearby town for groceries. I figure a couple of hours should be enough. Alejandro, can you handle that?" Raul asked. "Of course," Alejandro replied smoothly, but his eyes lingered on me for a moment. I felt my cheeks flush and reached for my glass of water to mask my discomfort. Raul noticed nothing, entirely consumed by his ideas. Alejandro, on the other hand, remained composed, but there was an undertone in his demeanor, as if he was testing how far I was willing to go. The night brought new unease. I lay awake in bed, listening to Raul's steady breathing as he slept. My thoughts refused to let me rest. I wanted to erase everything that had happened on the mountain, but the memories of that moment seemed seared into me. I could feel his hands on my skin, his breath, his strength. I knew I had to stay away from Alejandro. His presence in the house was becoming unbearable, yet every time I saw him, my heart raced uncontrollably. I closed my eyes, trying to calm myself. This was a mistake, a big, irreversible mistake. But why was it so hard to regret it? The morning started like any other, but I noticed that Raul had grown more observant. Usually he was absorbed in his work, but today, over his cup of coffee, his gaze lingered on me more than usual. "Are you feeling okay?" he asked suddenly, setting his phone aside. I froze for a moment, momentarily forgetting how to hold my cup. "Of course I'm fine. Why do you ask?" He shrugged, but his eyes remained focused. "You've seemed a bit distant lately. Maybe you need more rest." I forced a smile, trying to mask my unease. "Maybe. These mountains are a bit too quiet for me," I said, attempting to turn the conversation into a joke. Raul nodded, but the concern in his gaze lingered. That evening, he suggested we spend time together. "We don't get enough time alone. Let's just talk tonight," he said as we finished clearing the dishes after dinner. I agreed, feeling the need to restore some balance between us. I chose soft lighting for the room, lit a candle, and poured us each a glass of wine. I did everything I could to create a warm atmosphere. We talked about his work, his plans for the next year. Raul was trying to make the evening lighthearted, and I tried to be tender, attentive. But inside, I couldn't shake the tension. My smiles felt too forced, my gestures too deliberate. At one point, Raul placed his hand over mine and said, "Isabel, you know you can tell me anything, right?" I nodded, but I couldn't bring myself to say a word. At dinner later, Alejandro joined us. He sat across from me, calm and composed. His voice was confident, his jokes effortless. He seemed to have complete control over the situation, which only made me feel more vulnerable. At one point, while passing me a glass of wine, his fingers brushed against mine. It was so quick it could have gone unnoticed, but I felt it as sharply as if it had lasted an eternity. I averted my gaze, hoping Raul hadn't noticed, but I was wrong. His eyes moved from me to Alejandro, and then lingered on my hand. He didn't say anything, but I could feel the tension in the room grow heavier. Raul continued talking to his brother, but there was a new coldness in his tone. Each time he looked at me, I felt my pulse quicken. When dinner ended, I hurried back to the bedroom, but even lying in the dark, I couldn't sleep. Raul had become more attentive, his wariness growing, and I knew it wouldn't be long before he started asking questions. But that wasn't what worried me most. What haunted me was the fact that part of me, despite all the tension, still longed for moments like that fleeting touch with Alejandro. I tried to stay close to Raul, desperate to restore the balance that seemed to be crumbling. I tried to engage him in conversations, offered to help with his projects, but his work consumed most of his time. He was absorbed in his tasks, leaving me alone with my thoughts once again. Alejandro, however, found every possible moment to remind me of his presence. Sometimes it was a fleeting glance over breakfast, other times a brush of his hand as we passed each other. These gestures were maddening. I tried to avoid him, but in this house it felt like there was nowhere to hide. That evening, after Raul went off to make calls to his colleagues, I wandered into the living room. The fireplace still burned, casting a warm glow in the soft crackle of wood. I sank onto the couch, hugging my knees, hoping to find a moment of peace. "You're avoiding me," a voice said, making me jump. Alejandro stood in the shadows, leaning against the doorframe. His eyes glinted in the dim light, and I felt my heartbeat quicken. "I have nothing to discuss with you," I replied, trying to make my voice firm. He stepped forward, walking into the room. "You can pretend nothing happened, but that's not true. I see it in you." "You see nothing," I snapped, standing abruptly. "This was a mistake. We both know it has to stop." Alejandro smirked, but there was seriousness in his gaze. "A mistake? Then why are you trembling just standing near me?" His words struck like a blow. I wanted to argue, but I couldn't find the words. Inside, I felt torn between reason and the part of me that was drawn to him. "Leave me alone," I whispered, but my voice sounded more like a plea than a demand. "You don't want that," he said quietly, stepping closer. I felt his presence too keenly. His breath brushed against my skin, and in that moment I lost the ability to move. He leaned in and kissed me again. This time the kiss was slow, deep, as if he knew I wouldn't push him away. His hand slid over my shoulders, pulling me closer. I wanted to stop, but I couldn't. Every attempt to resist was drowned in how he held me, how his lips sought mine with a confidence that made my head spin. When I finally pulled away, my heart was racing. "This is wrong. I can't do this," I whispered, stepping back. Alejandro looked at me but didn't try to stop me. His face was calm, but his eyes held something that only deepened my doubts about myself. I turned and left, leaving him alone in the firelit room. But even as I returned to the bedroom and lay down next to Raul, my heart continued to pound as though I had just seen Alejandro for the first time all over again. The morning was steeped in tension. Raul, usually relaxed and focused on his tasks, had become noticeably more observant. His glances, though still kind, lingered longer than usual, as if searching for something hidden beneath the surface. Alejandro remained composed, his words and movements deliberate, but the tension between us was impossible to ignore. It lingered in every moment, fleeting glances, pauses in conversation, his quiet presence nearby. These unspoken connections heightened my unease, making it almost tangible. Raul was beginning to sense something. His behavior, though subtle, had taken on an edge of caution that unsettled me deeply. Later in the day, with Alejandro outside, Raul seized the opportunity to sit with me alone. He put aside his laptop and settled across from me. The silence between us stretched longer than usual. He studied me intently as though searching for answers without asking the questions. His unspoken concern hung heavily in the air, and I avoided meeting his gaze, brushing off the moment with an excuse of weariness. Raul's patience seemed to wane. His behavior throughout the day carried an undercurrent of suspicion. It felt as though he was waiting for the right moment to ask a question he already knew the answer to. I continued to evade him, but the tension between us grew heavier with each passing hour. By evening, as the house was bathed in the warm glow of the fireplace, the tension reached its breaking point. Alejandro and I found ourselves alone in the hallway. His presence, as always, was sudden and deliberate, and his eyes bore into me with an intensity that felt all-knowing. His expression was serious, resolute, as though he was ready to end whatever bound us. His words were quiet but piercing. Each one struck like a blade, unraveling the fragile web of denial I had spun around myself. His ultimatum was clear. He would leave if I couldn't decide. His tone was firm, almost harsh, and every word stirred a storm of anger, guilt, and confusion within me. I knew he was right. We couldn't continue this way, caught in a web of silent longing and unspoken truths. But his confidence in forcing a resolution felt merciless, tearing away the facade I had worked so hard to maintain. The sound of footsteps shattered the charged silence between us. Raul entered the room, his expression dark, his demeanor withdrawn. It was clear he had heard more than he should have. He said nothing, but his presence alone shifted the atmosphere. The weight of his unspoken questions bore down on me, making it clear that the time for secrets was running out. The evening caught me off guard. After a tense day, I realized I had to make at least one attempt to salvage what was left between Raul and me. The guilt over everything gnawed at me, but I also knew that if I let this fall apart, there would be no way back. I lit candles in the bedroom, chose a dress Raul always loved, and prepared a light dinner. His habit of working late, which usually frustrated me, gave me the time to set everything up. When he walked into the room, his face first showed surprise, then softened into a warm smile. He sat at the table, and for the first time in days, his expression was gentle. "You've surprised me," he said quietly, pouring wine into our glasses. Throughout the evening, I tried to focus on him. We reminisced about our early trips, laughed at old jokes, and I found myself wanting to believe in this calm. Raul held my hand, his fingers lightly brushing my skin, and I let myself believe that things could be mended. When he suggested we stay in the bedroom, I agreed, feeling neither fear nor hesitation. His touch was so familiar that, for a moment, it felt like time had turned back. We spent the night together, and I tried to enjoy the moment, feeling his love. But even in this closeness, something stopped me from fully being present. My thoughts drifted to Alejandro, his voice, his gaze, his confidence. All of it seeped into my memories, breaking the peace I was trying to build. Raul fell asleep, holding my hand while I stared at the ceiling, wondering why I couldn't let go of those moments that should have been forgotten. The next morning, I went down to the living room and saw Alejandro packing his things. His movements were calm but resolute. "You're leaving?" I asked, my voice unfamiliar even to myself. He stopped, turning to face me. His eyes held no anger, no regret, only weariness and inevitability. "I can't stay here and pretend I feel nothing," he said calmly. "It's a shame we won't be able to repeat the passion we had on the mountain trail. That was incredible, seeing you from behind as you let yourself go to our desire. And that view of the mountains." His words, direct and almost cruel, made me freeze. I didn't know how to respond and only watched as he picked up his bag and walked toward the door. When the door closed behind him, the house felt quieter than ever. I was left alone, consumed by conflicting emotions. His departure didn't bring relief. Instead, it left an emptiness I now had to learn how to fill. The house, now empty after Alejandro's departure, felt eerily quiet. His absence should have made things easier, but instead, it left a strange void. I tried to spend more time with Raul, to be attentive and affectionate again. Yet something between us had already cracked. Even in our warmest moments, there was a fragility, as if the smallest thing could shatter everything. After breakfast, Raul busied himself with cleaning. It was one of his habits. to put things in order as if tidying the house could restore order to his thoughts. I heard him moving chairs, stacking papers, organizing misplaced items. I tried to focus on my own tasks, but the tension in the air was palpable. Then the sounds from the kitchen stopped. A moment later, I heard him call my name. His voice was unusually sharp. "Isabel, can you explain this?" he asked as I entered the room. In his hand was a note. My eyes immediately caught the familiar lines, and my heart sank. It was Alejandro's farewell letter, hastily left behind. I hadn't even considered that Raul might find it. His gaze was hard, his face tense. I had no idea what to say. "He left this for you, didn't he?" he continued. "You thought I wouldn't notice?" I tried to respond, but the words stuck in my throat. All I could do was shake my head, though it only seemed to confirm his suspicions. "You lied to me," he said, his voice trembling with anger. "All this time you made me believe everything was fine while you—" "Raul, please listen to me," I began, feeling tears welling up. "It was a mistake. I didn't mean—" "Didn't mean to?" he interrupted. "You knew exactly what you were doing. You've destroyed everything we had." I couldn't hold back my tears any longer. They streamed down my face as his voice grew louder. There was so much pain in his words that I couldn't even attempt to defend myself. After that scene, we didn't speak again. Raul withdrew completely, shutting me out entirely. He no longer looked me in the eye, barely stayed in the same room with me. Every step he took, every glance he avoided, reminded me of how deeply I had betrayed him. Our relationship was falling apart. His silence was louder than any words. I could see him losing faith in me, his pain hardening into distance. I was left alone with my thoughts, unable to find peace. Everything I had built with Raul over the years was crumbling before my eyes, and I knew it was entirely my fault. The house was engulfed in silence, broken only by the occasional creak of snow falling outside the windows. Alejandro was gone, leaving behind only memories I desperately tried to erase. Raul had become a stranger, his silence so deafening it felt like an endless echo of his unspoken accusations. I was alone in a house that now felt less like a home and more like a stage for shattered promises and inevitable losses. Every corner reminded me of who I used to be before this collapse. Each morning began with emptiness. I got out of bed, feeling the weight of solitude, and returned to endless thoughts, replaying everything that had happened. Every moment, every decision, every glance, they all formed a chain of events that led to the loss of everything I held dear. I decided to have one last conversation with Raul. It was my final attempt to salvage the remnants of our marriage. I found him in the living room, sitting with his laptop, immersed in work that now served as a barrier between us. "We need to talk," I began, feeling the words catch in my throat. He looked up slowly, but there was no warmth in his eyes. "About what?" His voice was cold, indifferent. "I know I've ruined everything. I know you're hurt, but I want to fix it. I'll do whatever it takes," I said, almost pleading. Raul closed his laptop and looked at me intently. His face remained impassive. "You want to fix it?" he said quietly. "And how exactly do you plan to do that? Bring back trust? Restore the love that was built over years and destroyed in just a few weeks?" I remained silent, feeling the weight of his words crush me. "I can't trust you anymore, Isabel. You've destroyed everything we had," he said, turning his gaze away. His words were final. There was no anger in his voice, only exhaustion. I realized then that he had already made his decision, and all I could do was accept it. That evening, I sat by the window, watching the snow gently fall to the ground. Each snowflake, like a reminder of my mistakes, settled into a pattern that could never be undone. I wondered, was my weakness with Alejandro a mistake? Or was it a part of my true nature, a part of me I had always been afraid to acknowledge? The snow continued to fall, blanketing everything in white. But as I sat there, I felt that this cleansing of nature could never touch me,